Hello, Connecting Point. We're resuming our sermon series through the life of David, and we are picking up in 2 Samuel chapter 10 this week. Now, 2 Samuel 10 is a kind of a bookend story with 2 Samuel 8, which surrounds the David and Mephibosheth story, which we went through last week. And I almost should have put 10 with chapters 8 and 9 as well, but we'll use chapter 10 to set up what is upcoming in chapter 11, which is the heartbreaking story of David and Bathsheba. So to start off with today, I want to read through the whole of chapter 10, and then we'll break it down a little bit. So I'm reading from the NET translation. Later, the king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun succeeded him. David said, "I will express my loyalty to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father was loyal to me." So David sent his servants with the message, expressing sympathy over his father's death. When David's servants entered the land of the Ammonites, the Ammonite official said to their lord Hanun, "Do you really think David is trying to honor your father by sending these messengers to express his sympathy? No. David has sent his servants to you to get information about the city and spy on it so they can overthrow it." And so Hanun seized David's servants and shaved off half of each one's beard. He cut the lower part of their robes off so that their buttocks were exposed, and then sent them away. Messengers told David what had happened, so he sent them to the men who were thoroughly humiliated. The king said, "Stay in Jericho until your beards have grown again, and then you may come back." When the Ammonites realized that David was disgusted with them, they sent and hired 20,000 foot soldiers from Aram Beth Rehob and Aram Zobah, in addition to 1,000 men from the king of Makkah and 12,000 men from Ishtob. When David heard the news, he sent Joab and the entire army to meet them. The Ammonites marched out and were deployed for battle at the entrance of the city gate, while the men from Aram Zobah, Rehob, Ishtob, and Makkah were by themselves in the field. When Joab saw that the battle would be fought on two fronts, he chose some of Israel's best men and deployed them against the Arameans. He put his brother Abishai in charge of the rest of the army, and they were deployed against the Ammonites. Joab said, "If the Arameans start to overpower me, you come to my rescue. If the Ammonites start to overpower you, I will come to your rescue. Be strong. Let's fight bravely for the sake of our people and the cities of our God. The Lord will do what he decides is best." So Joab and his men marched out to do battle with the Arameans, and they fled before him. When the Ammonites saw the Arameans flee, they fled before his brother Abishai and went into the city. Joab withdrew from fighting the Ammonites and returned to Jerusalem. When the Arameans realized that they had been defeated by Israel, they consolidated their forces, and then Hadadezer sent for Arameans from beyond the Euphrates River, and they came to Helam. Shobach, the general in command of Hadadezer's army, led them. When David was informed, he gathered all Israel, crossed the Jordan River, and came to Helam. The Arameans deployed their forces against David and fought with him. The Arameans fled before Israel. David killed 700 Aramean charioteers and 40,000 foot soldiers. He also struck down Shobach, the general in command of the army, who died there. When all the kings who were subject to Hadadezer saw they were defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and became subjects of Israel. The Arameans were no longer willing to help the Ammonites. So the opening of our chapter is sending us way back into 1 Samuel to grab this idea from 1 Samuel. We've met this family who is ruling the Ammonite tribe before. Back in 1 Samuel chapter 11, we learned that Nahash was the king of the Ammonites who besieges the Israelite town Jabesh Gilead, and that's east of the Jordan. So the siege of Jabesh Gilead provides a backdrop for Saul's first success as the king of Israel. Remember that Saul had been anointed by Samuel, but then had just gone back to his fields in rural Benjamin territory. So when word comes to Saul about the siege at Jabesh Gilead, he slaughters one of the oxen that he's working with, and then chops it into pieces, and then sends the pieces around to all of the 12 tribes of Israel, saying, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't show up and help your brother Israelites to defeat the Ammonites who are besieging Jabesh Gilead. And so the tribes end up showing up, not wanting to get turned into steaks or whatever. They rally behind Saul, and Saul then succeeds in this first battle with the Ammonites. Nahash makes peace with Saul after this because he's beaten. And then Nahash also extends grace to David when David is on the run from Saul, thinking kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So last week we learned from Davis that David had now found some success in his early days of kingship as well, and he had stopped the Philistine and the Moabite threats. So David, in chapter 9, was looking to extend the generosity that God had shown him by reaching back out to Saul's family. He finds this boy Mephibosheth. Well, he's not probably a boy, he's a young man. But Mephibosheth became the object of David's extreme generosity. This week, we see David continuing in this trend, seeking to extend generosity to potential rivals in the area. So David had made peace with Nahash, as I said above, and David and Nahash sort of had a friend of my friend, or enemy of my enemy friendship against Saul. So in this message that David sends over to Hanun, the new king, Nahash's son, there might be something of a subservient relationship that's implied. Maybe David is saying something to the effect of, hey, Hanun, remember how I made peace with Nahash and now I'm the king of the big nation that beat your dad back in the day? It could be read as something like that. It's possible that David is expecting some tribute, or is just, in fact, from one state leader to another state leader, extending his condolences. It's likely, though, that David would be expecting Hanun to be somewhat humble towards David's ambassadors, as David is experiencing extreme, at least be generous and welcome them in. Hey, come on into the city. David's experiencing a string of victories over the Moabites and the Philistines and whatever else. If Hanun is a savvy strategist, he's not going to antagonize the kingdom that's on the rise, right? The toughest guys in the area at the time. It only makes sense. Okay, well, let's send you to your first table talk. So here's the question. What ought to happen when one shows ingratitude? Remember that the names of our characters are often very significant in the Old Testament, and this holds very much true in this story, where we see Hanun behave so shamefully towards David's ambassadors. Hanun means generous, so I think you can see that there's irony at play here. Furthermore, Nahash means snake. So here we have Mr. Generous, the son of the snake, repaying David's kind condolence with what amounts to a declaration of war. Here's what we think of your ambassadors, is kind of what Hanun is saying to David's ambassadors and to David by disgracing them in this way. So Hanun disgraces them, of course, by shaving off half of their beard. Israelite men always wore beards during this time period, except for in very specific religious rituals, or when they're in profound mourning, right? They're mourning, they tear out their beards, or they shave their beards. Hanun also cuts off their cloaks in such a way that these men are exposed. They have to go back to Israelite territory in disgrace. There's also something of a callback here to David cutting off Saul's cloak in the cave. Recall that David feels distraught at doing that action and actually repented of cutting off Saul's cloak. The Israelite cloak isn't just a piece of clothing. The bottom of it has these tassels, blue tassels, or a set of tassels, which are a physical reminder of God's covenant with them. They're a reminder to follow God's laws and ordinances. David, in cutting off Saul's cloak, cutting off maybe the bottom of the tassel, is making this kind of symbolic statement. You're cut off from God, right? You're cut off from your relationship with God. You're cut off from the law. And even though David was kind of authorized to do this, was ordained to do this, he felt guilty about going through with this action. Now, these poor ambassadors didn't just have their clothing defiled in this way, right? It's not just that moment. They're also exposed. They're embarrassed. These particular clothes are also referred to in this story that using a word that signifies something like an official uniform. This isn't just, their clothes. This is like the messenger of David kind of uniform. They're wearing a particular set of clothing that the king has probably given them to perform these specific duties, to be his mouthpiece, his eyes on the ground, his boots on the ground in Ammonite territory. So David does what he can to preserve these poor guys' dignity, lets them off the hook of showing back up in Jerusalem in front of their families and back at court until their beards have grown back. He gives them kind of reprieve from their duties to save face. In verse 6, we see that the Ammonites realize that David is furious with them. Some of the translations have this description where it says David sees them with disgust. There's this literal Hebrew phrase, and it says that the Ammonites had become a stench in David's nostrils. It's very evocative. I think we should see that this was all intentional. Hanun is intending to slight David and Israel and is provoking them into a war. Why exactly? Unclear. Nonetheless, the Ammonites begin their war preparations in earnest and go about securing an alliance with the Arameans with probably a cash payment. The Arameans are another Syrian tribe, and we had heard reference to them in our text last week in chapters 8 and 9 as we listened to the description of how David is working to secure the borders of Israel. So the Ammonites pay cash to the Arameans to show up and fight alongside them against the Israelites. Cash payment for a military alliance was common back then, as it is today. You can probably think of some examples in the news. Israel would later use the same tactic in the age of the 1st and 2nd Kings. They would buy alliances with their neighbors as well. When we get to verse 7, we get the first hint that trouble is about to break out in David's kingdom. David sends Joab out to deal with the problem. Keep that verb sent in mind when we get to our story next week. But for now, things are going to work out in this part of the story. Joab is sent with the Israelite army to deal with Mr. Generous. The Ammonites are arrayed out in front of their city while the Arameans stayed in a more mobile position out in the field, seeking to act as a hammer to the Ammonite anvil to crush the Israelite army. This is a time-tested tactic. It's been the death of more than one enemy in history, or more than one army in human history. However, there's some famous examples of an army who escapes from this hammer-anvil kind of action. And one of the most famous is Julius Caesar, who was faced with this sort of situation during his conquest/genocide of Gaul. Anyhow, he does the same tactic as what Joab does. He basically chooses to fight on both fronts rather than trying to concentrate on one and then turning around and hitting the other. We get this interesting note after the halving of the beards and the clothing that Joab, like Caesar those centuries later, ends up halving his army in order to face both ways at once, to face both enemies at once. Joab puts himself in charge of an elite unit of troops while ordering his brother Abishai to take charge of the rest. Abishai is to keep the Ammonites pinned against the city walls, while Joab turns and beats the Arameans. So if one side or the other of Israel's battle line can't handle itself, the other is supposed to come in as reinforcements and help. So for the Israelites, the reinforcements are closer, more likely to be able to hit back, but the risk of encirclement is really high. The risk of being stuck in the middle of the hammer-anvil action is very high, and the consequences of being hit from both sides at once could well prove disastrous. It's a really risky strategy that they pursue, but we find that it works out. Of particular note, we see that Joab gives a short but excellent speech to his troops. He implores them for 3 things, basically. 1 is to be strong. 2 is to remember that this is for their whole people. They're fighting for Israel. It's actually, even though they're in Ammonite territory, he sees it as a defensive action. It's a defense of the cities that they've conquered and which are now their inheritance from the Lord. It's also defending their honor, right? Considering what the way that the diplomats had been treated by Hanun. And then 3, that God is ultimately the one who is in charge. The Lord will, in fact, do as he sees fit. And Joab places this battle with the Ammonites and the Arameans as falling into this long tradition of holy war that begins under Moses during the Exodus and through Joshua and the Judges and all the rest. So let's go to another table talk. And here's an interesting question. Do you see this speech of Joab's as politically threatening to David? Go ahead and take a couple minutes with that. By this time in our story, Joab has repeatedly proven his worth as a soldier and his skill as a general. And here we actually see him prove his savviness politically as well. Joab doesn't ever really directly threaten David in David's lifetime, but Joab is maybe possibly angling himself to look at the throne. Remember, he is David's cousin. He's related, or nephew. Depends on how you read the lineages. And so he's from the right family, I guess, if David's family is the new legitimate family, royal family of Israel. And Joab shows here that he's savvy, right? He both succeeds in chasing the Arameans from the battlefield, but also places the credit for it upon God, where one would imagine David would also put it. What we see here is Joab succeeds in chasing the Arameans from the battlefield, and the Ammonites see this and then withdraw back into the city, allowing Abishai and his group of soldiers to pin them inside the city in a siege situation. So Joab heads back to Jerusalem and leaves Abishai there to hold the Ammonites inside of their fortress city. David has this one last success here now at the end of chapter 10 before he begins to truly falter as a ruler. Joab could easily have tried to grab all of the credit for this victory himself. Some of the commentators do see Joab as doing that political positioning of pushing and pitting himself against David with his actions in this story, and then the next few as we go forward. I don't know if I entirely buy that line. We are going to see that Joab increasingly becomes a problem during the rest of this story. Enough for David to issue some rather stern warnings about him to his heir Solomon when we get to the end of the story. But at any rate, right now, David is going to get the credit in this story for leading the army out to defeat the Arameans ultimately. So the end of our story has David, and presumably Joab again going with him, going back out and dealing a knockout blow to the Aramean Ammonite alliance by taking on the Arameans in the battlefield. So 40,000 dead, right? Or plus, who knows what the numbers actually are. That's I guess we take the word of it. Ancient battles are notoriously unreliable for numbers, but we can leave that alone. David defeats the Aramean king Hadadezer in a pitched battle. Hadadezer sends his general out, Shobach, to do it. So Hadadezer had tried to muster his forces against the expansive Israelites. Accentuating the holy war element of this story, once again, we have the names of the Aramean king, Hadadezer, which means the thunder is my help, right? Ezer is help, and Hadad is like the thunder, or like lightning kind of storms. So Hadadezer, who apparently is a person who's dedicated to praying to the thunder god or something like that, loses to Joab. Joab's name is the Lord is his father. And then Abishai, which means my father is Jesse, or we also get the father of gifts, or gift father, right? Or gift from the father, something like that. We have these very Hebrew names that honor the father of all, right? Of God. And we have then Hadadezer, who's also his name is honoring a pagan deity. David's success and the success of Israel is ensured by their persistence inside of the covenant faithfulness that God has promised David in chapter 7. And that's the correct response that the Israelites can give back to God. So the Israelites are seeing themselves in this lineage, and the narrator of our story is gently pointing this out to us through the names and through the way that God doesn't, have a big action or anything like that in this story. This sounds like, the Israelites win a fight and credit God with their strength, which is correct, of course. The Aramean and Ammonite alliance is broken. Geopolitically, this victory does a lot to secure Israel's position as the big dog in the region. Both of Egypt and the Fertile Crescent civilizations are in a downturn at this moment in history for a variety of reasons. And David's kingdom reaches something like its high watermark here. We're going to see that they're going to experience another victory at the end of chapter 12. But in the meantime, David is going to have this disaster unfold in his personal life. We're going to see that Israel has peace on its borders. Its enemies are defeated. They're licking their wounds. They're isolated from each other. They're not creating new alliances against Israel. And furthermore, David is now collecting tribute from them. And he's making an example of those like Hanun, the snake's son, who dishonor the people of Israel, right? However, we're going to see that at this high point, David begins to fail to treat everyone with justice, the way that we'd heard Davis describe it in chapter 8. Before we watch David descend into sin in our next story in chapter 11 next week, I want to ask you one last table talk question to reflect on as we close today. So here it is. How do you defend yourself against the proverb that you find in Proverbs 16 verse 18? And this is how that one goes. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Is it possible to avoid a fall when you're finding success? And maybe take time to pray together for humility and wisdom. Have a good week.